One thing that's cool about the horror genre is that sometimes it's so underappreciated that you'll just stumble on some movie you've never heard of on a random streaming service and think, looks kind of interesting. And you'll look online and the reception towards it will be sort of lukewarm and you'll go, okay, probably nothing special, but it looks cool enough, why not? And then you'll actually watch the film that got this middling reception and think, what the hell? That ruled. Why has nobody told me about this? Haunt is a 2019 slasher movie directed by Scott Beck and Brian Woods. If you recognize those names at all, that's because they are the guys that are responsible for bringing to life the massively successful Quiet Place franchise. But unlike A Quiet Place, which did big numbers at the box office, Haunt kind of came out with little to no fanfare on a limited release schedule and then just kind of got forgotten about. Or at least, I think it did, because up until 2 days ago when I watched it for the first time, I'd never even heard of this thing. And I don't want to toot my own horn here, but I'm kind of the slasher guy. I have a whole YouTube series about slashers. I feel like I have a near encyclopedic knowledge about that genre. I've got through, dare I say, a fair few of these things by now. And even the titles I haven't seen, I'm at least normally familiar with enough to know their general premise and whether they should be added to my to-see list or are not worth watching. And yet, here I am. One night as I take a break from writing to eat, I'm scrolling through the seemingly endless amount of movies I've already got through on Shudder, when out of nowhere this pops up and I don't recognize it. But I do have one immediate thought. That's a cool mask. That's a real cool mask. I'm such a sucker for a cool mask. In fact, it was such a cool mask that despite the middling reviews, I decided to give it a go. And I'm really glad I did because honestly, this could join that special pantheon of films that become a yearly Halloween tradition for me. Not only is Haunt a really fun slasher movie, it's also a deeply Halloween-y one. Obviously, horror films are always synonymous with this time of year just for the experience of a good scare being extremely fitting for the holidays, but it's surprising how little horror films actually feel Halloween-y. I realize I keep saying Halloween-y. I know it's a dumb word because it's made up and also has the word weenie in it, which makes it sound really silly, but I'm sorry, I've got nothing better. Saws. Plenty of films are set around the time, sure, but I can count on one hand the number of straight horror movies that really capture the spirit of this season. Like, there's obviously Carpenter's classic with its cold autumn vibes, there's Trick or Treat, which feels like a celebration of the day, there's The Guest, if you count that as a horror, but after that it gets a little tricky. Sure, there's fun Halloween flicks like Hocus Pocus and The Halloween Tree that definitely deserve a yearly viewing, but they're hardly the kind of thing that's going to send a chill up your spine. So it's great when that rare movie comes along that hits that sweet spot of being just scary enough and just Halloween-y enough to become a real horror October classic. And Haunt, for me, hits that sweet spot real good. Set on the big night itself, Haunt follows Harper, a young woman who, after just breaking up with her abusive boyfriend, heads out to a party with her roommates Bailey and Angela, where they meet up with some other friends they know, as well as newcomers to the group, Nathan and Evan. The whole night out, Harper feels tangibly uncomfortable. The last-minute decision to go to the party means she's the only one without a costume, and much worse than that, her ex-boyfriend berates her and demands her attention through text throughout the night, eventually culminating in an ambiguously threatening image being sent her way. As the night goes on, Harper grows more and more anxious and suspects her ex is stalking her, as a man in a devil costume keeps appearing when she's alone and acting suspiciously. And later, when the group are driving to find a haunted house to end the night on, she notices a truck following their car and asks to pull over to look out for it. Although the truck doesn't turn the corner behind them and the rest of the group don't see it, what they do end up seeing from the spot they stopped in is the switching on of a massive sign pointing to a haunted house. Taking this as a serendipitous sign from the universe, all of them, including a very reluctant Harper, decide to take the plunge and go inside. At the entrance to the attraction, they find one of the haunt's actors, a mute clown, who makes them surrender their phones and sign liability waivers. Something that's immediately reminiscent of the stories you hear about the deeply controversial, I'm hesitant to call it a haunt so much as inexplicably legal torture chamber, Makami Manor, which, along with other what you might call extreme haunts, I am willing to bet was very likely the inspiration for this film. The crew sign their waivers and head inside what first seems like a really cool high production value attraction, but things get a little sus when maybe one of the actresses playing a victim is putting on perhaps a bit too good of a performance. Naturally, you can see where this is going. The haunted house is less of a fun, scary walk full of costumed theatre kids, and more of an elaborate setup for a gang of serial killers with arguable cult vibes, I think, to have victims volunteer themselves up freely to be subjected to their monstrous whims, all in the backdrop of a sadistic nightmare maze. And for the rest of the movie, we watch the group slowly piece together that something is extremely wrong with this place, use their wits to rise to the attraction's challenges, and dodge the killers in an effort to escape with their lives. It's a pretty simple premise and setup for a slasher. Group of teens go to a Halloween night haunted house, everything is not what it seems, slasher shenanigans ensue. But where Haunt rises above being just another generic slasher movie, albeit with a fairly unique setting, is in just how much creative fun the filmmaking team are able to pull out of that concept. The haunted house isn't just a neat backdrop for the movie, it's the star of the show. With an estimated budget of $5 million, which, just to put that into perspective, their previous film, A Quiet Place, had a $17 million budget, and even that's considered to be pretty on the low end of things. The creative team behind this movie managed to create an elaborate funhouse of varied scares. Swirling tunnels, trapdoors, mystery holes, ceilings covered in knives, a spider room, oh we hate the spider room, secret coffin passageways, tight crawl spaces, a room full of what you hope are creepy mannequins and not potential killers in sheets. This film is full of such cool set pieces and set decoration that if this place were genuinely a real haunted house, it would be so popular because it looks awesome. I mean, besides the murder, obviously, that would make it a little less popular and probably hurt repeat business. And for me, you could get rid of the spiders room, to be honest. No spiders and we'll have a grand old time. Haunt isn't just about the crazy set though. Its production values are great across the board. The film is shot and lit really well. The movie heavily leans into its own artifice in a really clever way to achieve some really creative aesthetics and cinematography. Because the whole narrative is staged in this kind of artificial funhouse scenario that's set up to be big and dramatic, it allows the film itself to be big and dramatic in return. Every room can have different lighting and styles without it feeling like a clash of tones. From this cold, fluorescent, clinical aesthetic to grimy boiler rooms coloured with bronzy golds to stylishly theatrical pronounced reds and blues, there's a great deal of appealing visual variety on display that never feels at odds with the movie's grounded slasher tone. I could go on and on about the production design of this thing. Literally everything looks great in this movie, even before we enter the haunted attraction shenanigans. As we spend the first 15 minutes or so of the movie just getting to know our main cast, you get a great deal of atmosphere and setting with all the Halloween decorations and stark lighting choices. And before I move on, I simply can't talk at this length about the production design of Haunt without mentioning those absolutely fantastic killer costumes and masks. After all, they're the whole reason I decided to watch this thing. It's kinda hard to make a killer in a mask stand out amongst the crowd these days, since so many icons have laid down the foundation of what good design on that front looks like, that it's very easy to feel derivative of their efforts. And the mask killer trope has been around for so long that such imagery is deeply oversaturated with a wide variety of designs and competition. But there's something about Haunt's back to basics but kind of polished approach that just speaks to me. Every one of these antagonists looks spectacular. They've got these simple designs and costumes that really give off that Halloween feel, throwing back to a sort of vintage, almost 1950s retro kitsch paper mask and string vibe, but in a way that looks like it has such a modern sheen to it. I don't know exactly what it is or how to articulate it, but they just kind of tickle that nostalgic part of my brain that remembers seeing cheap masks in Poundland as a kid whenever October was dawning, or like the first time I saw the iconic Halloween 3 masks. What's even crazier still then is that even with these masks looking as good as they do, would you believe this is one of the very rare instances where the killers being unmasked in a slasher movie is a good move? You'd think abandoning such a perfect look at any point in the film would diminish the threat of these villains, but But as it happens, they look even better without them. The prosthetic designers Chris Bridges and Hugo Villaseñor took inspiration from the body modification community to give these killers an extremely unique and memorable look, and man, the clown and the devil especially look fantastic, and you know I'm a sucker for a theatrical face. Genuinely one of the most memorable aspects of the whole movie. Okay, so the whole thing's got flawless production design. We've established that. But is the rest of the film just as flawless? Unfortunately, not really. There's some stuff here and there that doesn't quite work, but that doesn't mean that this thing is all style, no substance. There's a lot of stuff worth appreciating outside of its excellent visual design too. Let's start with the good. First of all, the acting is great. Though our supporting cast don't really get fleshed out enough to fully fall in love with, the main crew all have enough natural chemistry and likability that when things start going south, you have a real reason to care. And the villains put on some great performances. Apparently, the clown role performed by Justin Markson almost didn't go to him because he was a longtime friend and collaborator of the two directors, and they had a hard time buying that their goofy, lovable friend could ever come across in the sinister way they needed the clown to. Fortunately, they eventually were able to separate that perception of their friend from the character, and I am so glad they did. Justin took inspiration from the fantastic screen villains of Javier Bardem in No Country for Old Men and Philip Seymour Hoffman in Mission Impossible 3 to deliver a really chilling performance. Also, while we're spotlighting the villains, who again are all great, I do want to give a shout out to the Ghostface dude, whose soft-spoken performance delivers some excellent tension, especially in the scene where he asks a character if he wants to see his face. You'll know what I mean when you see it. It's real gripping stuff. Something I also really appreciated is the film isn't afraid to get real gory, but in a rather smart decision, the filmmakers are pretty reserved in how often this happens. So when there is a striking moment of extreme violence, it genuinely is shocking because everything else is a bit more tame and you're not expecting it, because you haven't had a chance to become desensitized. A lot of horror movies have a tendency to go in one direction a little too far, either too goreless to go for a softer rating but at the cost of making the film feel like it has less stakes, or so gore-hungry that it basically all becomes visceral meaninglessness. I appreciated how subdued Haunt was in the manner in which it deployed its violence to make it leave the biggest mark. The thing that doesn't work, however, is just some elements of the plot and the story don't really land. Plot-wise, the film has what is, on paper, I think, a fantastic ending. But while I never want to have those kinds of criticisms where you're like, there's a plot hole in this movie, or that part doesn't make sense, how'd they get there so quick? Even I must admit that the circumstances around this film's conclusion are so contrived that it takes away somewhat from the cathartic joy you should be experiencing and the punchy, smart nature of it. Like, it is a good ending, and it's the right ending for the characters, but you just really have to switch your brain off to allow it to happen. And I think that makes it hit a little less than it maybe should. Story-wise, man, the themes of this film, all over the place. You remember in my quick overview I mentioned the abusive boyfriend? You remember how it never came up again in the rest of the overview? Well, that wasn't me hiding some big twist or anything, it's just that, as a theme throughout the movie, feels almost completely disjointed from the rest of the plot. I am always happy when films strive to be more than just a fun example of their genre. And I really do appreciate that there was a clear intention here to discuss themes of abuse and make the film a little bit richer than a no-frills slasher flick. The thing is though, sometimes there's nothing wrong with a no-frills slasher flick. And this is one of those rare instances where, you know what, actually, it might have been better just keeping things simple. Because while the theme of abuse is there, they just don't commit to it in an interesting enough way to make it not feel tacked on. There's more to it than just the abusive boyfriend, to be fair, though his whole input on the plot is really quite minimal and resolved in a manner that's almost entirely separate from the actions of our protagonists, which isn't great, but again, like, to be fair, there's more to it than that. You see, throughout the film, our main girl Harper slowly reveals a history of abuse. It's never outrightly said, but I feel like it's heavily implied that her current abusive relationship stems from her familiarity with abuse in the home that she grew up in, an environment where her father would regularly physically abuse her mother, something she describes as like growing up in a haunted house, which I understand is the writers trying to find a way to thematically tie the theme of abuse to the plot of the movie, but that connection is tenuous at best. The parallels feel really very forced, and I do not get the connection between being in an awful haunted house attraction with serial killing psychopaths and being a kid in an abusive household. Even when the film goes so far as to hold my hand and go, hey, look, you see what we're doing here? Both these situations are violent, and that means they're metaphorically similar. Are they though? Would being in the army be similar to growing up in a domestically abusive household because that's noisy and violent? Would shooting a horror movie or attending WrestleMania? I just feel like you need to explore your metaphor a little bit more before you try and draw these parallels. It could work. I'm not saying it's impossible to comment on abuse in personal relationships through this plot, because at times they almost have something. Hopper gets a full character arc where she reappropriates the violence for her own means of survival at the end, so that's kind of interesting on the abuse angle. I'm not sure exactly what it's trying to say in this context, but there's something that could be explored further there. And to its credit, there is one really cool bit of imagery where Hopper is hiding under a bed in the attraction, and as the killer steps with heavy boots into the room, the scene is intercut with her hiding under the bed from her dad as a child. That's cool. That's interesting. Could we have more of that maybe? Because as it stands, other than this, all we have is the character winking at the audience as she explicitly says her life was like a haunted house, and an abusive boyfriend character who is barely in the movie and has little to no bearing on the narrative. Something I really think they could have rolled into here is the imagery of masks. Hopper's father in flashbacks outside of his violent rages speaks really calmly to Hop. He speaks sweetly and reassures her she doesn't need to be scared of him, and that mummies and daddies just fight like this sometimes. And like, that's a mask, right? That's a mask and a disguise this violent man puts on to present nicely. And you've got that in a film that's absolutely full of mask imagery and killers who keep telling their victims to take off their masks with seemingly no real thematic reason. I don't know, I'm just spitballing, but maybe they could have done something there. Maybe have it established that Harper's father was loved by the community at large because all they see is the mask he puts on in public and not the violent man behind it. Then, you know, you've got this haunted house attraction and oh look, it's harmless and it's just a funny actor in a clown mask being silly for harmless scares. He won't hurt you, but beneath the surface are all these incredibly violent and dangerous people. They're just wearing masks so that you trust them. Hell, the attraction itself is kind of a mask. A violent experience masquerading itself as a safe and playful one. These kind of parallels ring way more true to me than I lived in a haunted house all my life. And I think the discussion around the idea of the masks violent men wear is way more focused than just sort of generally gesturing to the topic of abuse but giving no real further examination. I think maybe the film was trying to do the mask thing if I'm generous in my readings of it, but I don't know, that might be me just trying to give it the benefit of the doubt because I like it so much otherwise. And either way, if that was the case, they needed to commit to that exploration way more, because presently, it just feels like lip service towards a heavy topic that exists solely to elevate the film beyond being just a slasher, when in fact its disjointed connection actually brings the quality of the film down, and it probably would have been better if it had been just a slasher. Because if you put aside all that loose theming and just focus on all the positives, the great performances, the fabulous style, the creative set pieces, and the intricate production design, then as far as slashers go, it's a really good one. Hey, you, donate to Trans Lifeline or buy my Trans Lifeline charity shirt. Donation link is below and shirt link is in the description. We're doing this whole month of videos in support of them. As always, remember to like, comment, and subscribe to my OnlyDans with the red button and hit the bell. And a big huge thanks to all those who have donated so far, as well as all of my patrons, which if you'd like to become one to support the channel and get some cool exclusives, you can do so at the link in the description below. Oh, and in unrelated to charity efforts, your skeleton pal is actually an advisor on the latest entry in the smash hit horror documentary franchise, In Search of Darkness. So if you'd be interested in picking up their newest effort and first foray into the 90s decade, your bony boy here can offer you a special 10% discount code to tell him Dan Drambles sent you. code and link in the description. Finally, I just want to say, if you wouldn't mind, please use your free daily votes to vote for me to be this year's Face of Horror at the link in the description, assuming I am still in the running at the time of this vid's release. And if you feel so inclined, you can buy extra votes and support the B+ Foundation for Childhood Cancer Research while doing so. Thanks again, and I'll see you all tomorrow.